This is KUTV Primetime News with Irene Mwangi.
Thank you for staying tuned. As we promised, we'll be looking into the debt burden and the deficit when it comes to the budget. We have seen the National Treasury release the draft budget policy statement that shows that we'll be having a deficit of 1.0 trillion. And therefore, we had an interview earlier on with Nambala Member of Parliament, Honorable Sako Bonyase, to give us details on what should be looked into when it comes to the budget policy statement. Take a listen. Thank you so much, Honorable Sakwa Bunyasi, for making time. I want us to talk about the recently released draft budget policy statement that talks about having a budget of the year 2021-2022 of 3.02 trillion shillings. When you look into that particular budget, what can you read from it as an economist?
Thank you very much, Irene. First, let me say something about what the budget policy statement is. We call it the BPS, using these abbreviations. The budget policy statement is intended to give a forward notice, advance notice to the country of what size of budget, what priorities government has got, and therefore what sort of size of budget will result in, what the major thrusts are in there, what areas they put emphasis on. And then beyond that, they're now going to produce more specific documentation with the numbers in, with subsectors in. And by the time the budget is completed, it is for all sectors, for all the big items and the line items in there. Because finally, once the budget is approved, it's uploaded into IFMIS. And in the IFMIS, you can only upload specific things. So now it's a broad one. Even the numbers are broad, are going to be debated, discussed. There may be some changes. There are always some changes on it. At the margin, you don't redo the whole thing, because it takes a lot of time to do that. And also the country follows a policy where it is last year's budget and completed things plus the new ones. So there's a section of the budget that does not completely change. So this year's budget will be an estimate of 3 trillion, and I think it's 3.02 trillion. The 02 is, the 2 there is 100 million. That is also not small. It's 3.02 trillion. As you know, Kenya has prided itself on having the largest budget in the East African community area. They say, in fact, that the Kenya's budget, if you equalize the exchange rates of these monies, Kenya's is almost like the rest of those countries added together. So Kenya is about 50% of the total of the community area. It's also pride many times because we have a bigger economy and so on. But what matters for the budget is not that you're bigger than somebody else. What matters is where the money is going, if it's doing the kinds of priorities that will grow the economy. The budget has several components generally. One of it, we start by putting aside from the money you'll collect in revenue. It's essentially the money you expect will fund your budget, your own money. But usually it doesn't happen like that. We shall explain shortly. So you estimate how much money you'll collect, your own money you'll collect, and whatever money you get, the first charge goes to services that government must pay directly, guaranteed, the consolidated fund services. They pay the judiciary from there, they pay debt from there, and so on. That needs to be put aside.
Now, an issue that has raised controversy among economic experts is that the National Treasury has claimed that they are having a deficit of 1 trillion shillings. That means they will have to borrow more. Are we trending on a dangerous path when it comes to the borrowing here in the country?
So now, these projections I have got are saying that the government will need to borrow 1 trillion. That's a lot of borrowing in 1 year. It's a projection. Usually projections are around 400 to 600 billion. This one is projecting 1 trillion. And the reality is always bigger than the projected amount. The reason is that they are estimating that the debt service will be 1 trillion, but they're also saying that revenue will be 1.7 trillion, which will be a near all-time record, at a time when the economy is still just struggling to get It's not getting out of COVID. It's struggling to live with COVID. These are all budgets. Sometimes they say post-COVID. We have nothing post anything. It's still a budget in COVID. Post, we don't know when it will come. It could be 2 years, it could be longer. When we can now say, COVID is behind us, let us plan for post-COVID. So we are still in COVID. The Treasury has estimated that they'll have a revenue of about 1.7 trillion, 1,700 billion shillings. Now, if that is, let's accept that that's what they will get. On that basis, they have worked on the various numbers, and they have said that the money they'll have, that they may not have in the consolidated fund, plus their revenue, will finance about 2 trillion. And therefore, the remaining trillion to make 3 will be borrowed. Now, where the projection then does not work fully is supposing the revenue projected to be collected this year will not be 1.7. Suppose it's 1.3. And it happens, or let us be generous, 1.5. It means there's another 200 billion or 0.2 trillion that will not be there. So the deficit now will be bigger. Supposing it's only 1.3 that you collect. So out of 1.7, it means 400 billion is not there that you thought it would be there. So on top of the borrowing of 1 trillion, all these shortfalls in revenue, you add to the borrowing. You can do it 2 ways. You can cut back the budget, but cutting budgets is a big issue. So what they do, they simply add it to the amount to be borrowed. So our borrowing amount is projected to be 1 trillion, but in actual fact, it's likely to be more. To be more by large percentages. It can be more by 20, 30, or 40%. Me, I think it will be off by 40%. Why? Because our collections have been hovering around, in fair years, before COVID, around 1.3.
You are a member of parliament, and economic experts have estimated that by June 2022, the debt will be 8.6 trillion. Now, that is 0.4 trillion shy of the 9 trillion ceiling. And therefore, the question has been raised that members of parliament will have to return and review the debt ceiling that was supposed to stay over until 2024. What can you say concerning that particular trajectory?
Yeah, a couple of things. The debt ceiling had been agreed to be 9 trillion. It's already projected to surpass it, because the most generous estimate now is saying that the outstanding debt as of end of June, first they said was 7.8. Some people think it's 8.4. So we did not quite, I can't pin down a number, let's say I said of December, what truly it is. Granted that there may be some small adjustments, but it's clear that the trillion would fully surpass. But if it's about 8.4, even if they borrowed only 600 billion, it will still surpass or hit the 9 trillion. 9 trillion, you have said clearly in your opening remarks, was projected to support the government's operations through end of 2023, that only in 2024 do we need to surpass that ceiling. If someone has to go to the records of Parliament, which are in the what we call Hansard, the recording system of Parliament, they would find that we told the CS that it was not being completely open on this one, that in fact giving them a higher ceiling is giving them liberty to borrow even more. And here we are in essentially end of 2020, on 2020 year, financial year, we have actually surpassed it. We probably are almost there. And now we have another 2 years to go on what they want. Even if they seek this ceiling to be 12 trillion, it won't last much through 2022. It will not, because the borrowing necessity has ballooned. Until that balloon passes through the economy, where we are able to restrain how much we are spending while we finance that debt, until we shall now get in the chain not a big balloon or a huge additional borrowing. If the economy has grown a bit and we have restrained how we spend our money, then we can now foresee a period in which we shall not be needing significant amounts of borrowing. We might always have some little deficit, but not the kinds that we have got now. So things are still very tight for us. But when you hear the story of debt and the story of how the economy is going and why the budgets are, if you listen to the people in Treasury, they have a storyline to tell you. If you talk to the money markets here, they know why there are quite different problems. If you look at the international scene, how much how we are looking for money, and we do look for money, and they know out there. You seek to see whether in fact you can float a bond and get some money or not. We are talking to the IMF. If you talk to the IMF, it means things are really, really bad. The IMF doesn't come in when things are kind of normal at all. So we are in a difficult place.
Let's now focus to the bill that you presented in Parliament that is almost being taken to public participation, whereby you wanted the government to be gagged in terms of borrowing. What can you elaborate concerning that particular bill? Because many have said that that bill will be the salvation when it comes to the borrowing appetite by different regimes.
The bill says, how much do you borrow? From whom do you borrow this money? Can you give us an idea? Can you give the nation an idea whether this borrowing is really a required borrowing or not? How do you arrive at a required borrowing? You have to know the size of the economy, how it's going to function, and then what the proposal is to say, oh, to keep this size of the economy, government will spend the following in the budget, and we project the following revenues. Somebody has to recheck that, because that's why you are getting this estimate of 1 trillion and turns out to be 1.4 trillion. So in a sense, you are getting a budget approved with a bigger deficit than the truth. So we want an agency to regularize this, to provide expert opinion to the Treasury and to inform Parliament directly, not through Treasury. So as they inform Treasury, they inform Parliament, because Parliament has an oversight role to play. So when the Treasury comes, they also know that Parliament is equipped with information that our estimates are not right. They are likely to revise them before they come. So this is not going to stop government from borrowing. It's going to force government to borrow in the least cost way possible, to minimize the cost of loans over time as much as possible. It's not going to stop them borrowing, but it will force them to rethink. Is our pipeline of projects one that has been evaluated? The other day we heard of some big projects, many billions, where the feasibility study had not even been done. Now you can't grow like that. So are there feasibility studies in the pipeline? Has it been agreed? What rate of return is this likely to give us? If it's a very low one, you go to one with a better rate of return. And so on this. And when I say you leave the very low one, because these rates of return are not just financial, no. They are economic. And if it's economic, you take care of the benefits of something going to the very poor regions. So even if the financial returns look low, the gains for the year are big. Those are also included. So you look at these returns and you say, let's put these ones forward, the ones with good returns forward, and the ones with the low socioeconomic returns behind. They can come later down the pipeline. This debt authority would be interested to know the quality of the expenditure, the basket of expenditures the government is pursuing, and to advise the Treasury and to say, your borrowing is going to be X, it does not need to be that high, because look at your pipeline. These basket of expenditures are not even ready to have entered into the budget as yet. Work on them. While you work on them, you'll reduce your budget for that year. It comes in the following year. Over time, things will enter the pipeline when they're properly analyzed, and you'll get steady. That's how Kibaki managed when he was there, to leave an image that he had a very good management of the economy.
When you look into that particular budget, there are different priorities that have been set in place, one being the Big Four agenda, another being cushioning Kenyans during the COVID-19 pandemic. When you look into the finances that have been put into the different priorities in the span of 1 year, will we be able to implement some of them, given that this is the final financial year for President Uhuru Kenyatta?
The priority areas that we've got are still going to be health and education. Health, because we are still deep inside COVID, making our difficult situation much worse. And we have to give increasing attention and great attention, both by the national government and by the counties in that process. 2, because we are in COVID, the COVID protocols require, anti-COVID requirements require that we space out the sitting like we are sitting with you here. That is, in classes there is some separation, and you know, in many areas where the weather is allowing, some kids sit inside the class, others sit outside. Sort of get the spacing you need. When the rains come, that will be impossible. So education comes in also as a very core area of expenditure, to comply with the COVID regulations to allow our schools to continue. But there are also ongoing investments the country had, not necessarily because of COVID, as we said earlier, maybe because of Agenda 4 priorities. Agenda 4 priorities include industrialization, which means for us to industrialize in this country, to a large extent, agriculture must be functioning. The surpluses we get from there is what will produce our flour exports, is what will produce our milk for processing, is what will produce the meats for the meat industry, is what will produce the cereals to be processed into various products, from flour to oils for different things, to other industrial detergents and things that we produce out of this. Our industrialization is heavily dependent on the performance of our agriculture. So a revival of agriculture is in many ways the revival of our industry. We need to put resources there. They did put some resources there. And I've mentioned the social side like health and education that are important. Infrastructure has continued. I don't have the numbers against each of the categories, but infrastructure has continued to be important. We have a lot of roads that were pledged and are in the process of retarmacking or construction. Those need to be completed. They are very important for the next generation of this economy growing. We finished some years back things like the standard gauge railway. We're still waiting to see what its benefits look like and so on.
Now, when it comes to the revenue sharing formula, we estimated that in this particular financial year, the county governments will be receiving 370 billion shillings, so as to estimate. But when we look into the estimations that have been made in the draft budget policy statement, we are seeing that the counties have only increased, the money for the counties has increased by 10 billion shillings only. Now, are we seeing a controversy that we saw last year when it comes to the passing of the revenue sharing formula?
For a high amount was brokered by the executive, by His Excellency the President. It was an arrangement to break the stalemate. And they embraced it, the Senate embraced it. But there were questions after the President pronounced. Even the President promised to them to move from 316, where they are stuck for 2 years, to 370 or so. There must be somewhere where something has to give way. Yeah, you can't do everything you want to do, and then suddenly you have another 40-something billion to give. You can, of course, say that instead of the money going to central government, it can be taken away from central government to add it to the county government. And then the question is, where in central government are you going to reduce from? It doesn't mean there isn't, but it would take a certain orientation to be willing to make that decision. And remember, those people putting together the budget are national government people. And I'm sure that the pressure on the Treasury by the different sectors is such that you can't touch their sector. Every sector is very important, or every expenditure category. So if you're unwilling to cut from those, you're not going to get money to give to what you have promised. And I can foresee that the counties are going to be very unhappy. So this year's discussion on the division of revenue, which is that which divides total revenue between the national government and the counties as a block, is going to be a very controversial one, because it was a promise made. But it was quite clear from a financial and economic point of view that was not a promise that could be made, because there was no indication then where the money can come from.
Now, let's look into these things into perspective as we finalize. Economic experts have said that the debt to GDP ratio should be below 40%, something that IMF has also called upon and been keen on. But when we look into our country as Kenyans, we are seeing the debt to GDP ratio being above 60%. Now, what can be the salvation, or what can be the solution to the debt burden that Kenyans are now staring at?
Our salvation lies in the recovery in the economy. It does not lie in the generosity of outsiders to give us money, because those are loans, or even insiders to give us money. Remember, for a long time our debt was almost half-half between that from outside Kenya and that from inside, the domestic one versus the external one. The last numbers I saw was showing a sharp increase, the domestic one, to about 500, if the numbers were correct, over 500 billion, and the external being about 360 something, or yeah, so a total of 930 billion borrowing. That's what they said. You have to believe their numbers. That meant they have increased somewhat sharply the borrowing domestically from our own institutions. That's a problem, being that when you borrow from local banks, each bank is allowed by law to lend a certain amount. Now, if most of that goes to government, when the private sector comes, our industries, our companies, our individuals, they can't get more money because banks have a certain limit of how much they can lend. And that money has gone to government. And banks prefer to lend to government because for government, you are granted an interest rate, they will pay. They will not refuse to pay. They cannot fail to pay. But to individuals, you have supervision, you have follow-up, it takes costs, and you can actually lose you make a loss provision on those loans. So we know banks are likely to fall in the trap of lending to government, and therefore denying money to the private sector, and therefore denying money to the economy, a chance to grow the economy. So that's why domestic borrowing, I'm simplifying it, but that's why domestic borrowing is less desirable than external borrowing. Now, external borrowing, people say it's better because you leave the domestic scene intact. Enough money for banks to service industry and run things as if things were normal. And that what you borrow from outside, the only risk, the risk on it is the exchange rate risk. For example, if you borrowed $100 and you have to pay back 100, and say it's 10% interest, and you have to pay back 110 after whatever period they've agreed, say a year, you can project, yes, it will be, surely it will be 110. But now, when you borrow at 100, the exchange rate as it has been in Kenya is 100 shillings per dollar. But now when you are going to pay back, it has moved to 100 and I don't know what now, maybe 12, 115%. Let's say $115 is now 15% more, let's say. So what you borrowed for $100 for 10,000, now you have to pay $110 for 100. No, first the $100 at 15,000 plus the 10% that, of course, is the interest. So just the loan itself goes up by 15%, and so servicing that debt makes it more expensive. The money must come from your budget, so it takes away money from education and health, because it's what you collect as revenue, as taxes, that is going to be used to pay back these debts. So external borrowing has also got that disadvantage, that there are risks also involved in it. But economists and finance people know how to calculate these risks, and you can say, even though there is a risk, let's just take this risk or this kind of loan than this risk on our domestic borrowing, and so on. So that, in any case, is going to continue to be important. So whereas the current estimate is about $1 trillion, which is about 55%, slightly more perhaps, external, and about 45% domestic, and about 45% external, it's likely to rise sharply. If it rises sharply, it will depend on whether the government has secured enough resources elsewhere. They'll get some resources inflows from the IMF, multilateral institutions like IMF, World Bank, African Bank, and the other multinationals and institutions. Their rates are generally lower than the rates you borrow, even on the Eurobond when you are borrowing commercial paper. So after that generosity is included, there will still be some money to borrow. Tell those who prepare the budgets, you're projecting a $1 trillion deficit, but we see easily a $1.5 trillion deficit. And to argue on it at a technical level by using numbers and so on, and maybe convincing each other that in fact it's not 1 trillion, yes, it's 1.4, not 1.5, but 1.4. But that must be done. Now it's not being done. There's some low-level discussion internally, but those should just be memos. They all report to the same person who's going to. We want an independent entity that the CS does not control. The CS Treasury does not control. It's a government entity, but CS does not control. So it can give him independent advice. He can reject that advice. When it comes to Parliament, we shall know that there was this advice and that CS has rejected. It's the wisdom of Parliament now to make a